So tonight we have, it's a last talk of the summer. Yes? Yeah? You want to come back? Yes, okay. It's free to come, but next year. Yes? So tonight we have a talk with David Berlow, and I will introduce David. I have to say a few things about him. I learned some stuff recently. He told us about his life on the other day when we were at the restaurant. He told me right after to don't say a word to present him as someone else, but I have to tell you what he told me the other day. So David, maybe something I don't recall completely perfectly, and he will correct me after, but David was always interested in letter form since his young age. He's a son of an artist, of a doctor, but the first time he encountered with fine arts on typography, it was in the Rocky Mountain. He was there to ski on the snow, and he meets a professor who suggests him to study art at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Berlow at this time still did not ever know it was possible to be a typeface designer rather than just a user of typeface. And then after his study, he decided to move to New York and to search for a job. So the first job was in advertising agency, but after 2 months he realized that it's not something for him. So you have to find another position. And so you have sent a few letters, and suddenly you receive a call from Linotype and say, he wasn't there actually, but someone with him, probably his father, or say, yes, David, we receive a call from Linotype, you have to call them back. And so he was accepted on this company. So he entered in type industry in '78. As a letter designer at Mergenthaler, but in this place he was the youngest of the company, and so the first computer began to arrive on these companies, and David was the most capable to use this kind of computer. More sound.
Thank you.
Okay, it's back. Cool. So at this moment, the first computer began to arrive, and they began to digitize with Icarus system, and he wanted always to do much more than the Icarus limitation on such very big machine at the time. So he tried to do so much things that Icarus were not happy with that. So at some point, you have to leave Linotype to find a new activity to continue to produce typeface on the computer. So he joined a new company called Bitstream in the early 80s, and then he continued to work on the digitization process and to make the thing happening on the screen, and also to think about interface design. So when you have interface, to be able to play with the curve, to play with the shape, because at the time, before with Icarus, it's just, you have to draw on paper and to scan it again, or to digitize it again, but no way to interact with the basic curve or the spline or the curve at the time in such machines. So he tried always to go more far than the computer or the software be able to provide to the team at the time. So even when he was at Bitstream, one day he said, okay, I have a good idea. Could you add to the software copy-paste? Copy-paste, yes. Before on the computer, no way to copy-paste any shape. And he said, so the boss of the company said, yeah, copy-paste, but how many hours you can save by week to be able to, if we activate that, he said 6 hours. I said, yes, so it was implemented in the software. So, you know, David, it's always pushing the thing more far than the limit of the software of the company. So, yes, my face ID, okay. And then, at some point at Bitstream, some limitation appear because the invention of the Macintosh, mid-80s, and very soon after, a photographer was there. So no need this big machine to produce a typeface anymore. With a simple tool on a simple computer, you can produce your typeface. So David was there and said, okay, we will have to move away, and I have just to design typeface with photographer on his computer. So he launched a new company with Roger Black. The name of the company was, at the time, Font Bureau. And for Font Bureau was suddenly one of the major players in the US, because they worked for a lot of software companies, a lot of newspapers everywhere in the country. Also, I can say that I'm sure in this room, every of you at some point in your career already used some of the David Berlow typeface that it touched in the operating system that you use, the newspapers that you read. At some point, you have his typeface in the front of you to read some text. Also, I can say that David is one of the most influential type designers in US, because without him, a lot of young type designers probably never been into this business. So I will quote the name of 3 designers: Tobias Frère-Jones, Christian Schwartz, Cyrus I. Smith, but there is many others who are under his influence to be a major type designer today. So more recently, he decided to go to another world with type network. So he decided to restrain from Font Bureau and to find a new way to distribute fonts, and to also to make every type designer respected as a foundry. So it's all the type designers at Font Bureau now, they have their own foundries, and they are separate, and they are a proper entity, but they are part of a larger group in an independent studio called Type Networks, who help to publish and to distribute the typeface. So you can see that all the time, David is always at the fringe of the new things for the future. So welcome, David. I'm very happy to have you, my friend, so please.
Well, one of the things I didn't tell him that I'll tell you is that when I was a small child, I dreamed that I would grow up and come to Paris and give a presentation to a bunch of half-drunk people. So this is truly a dream come true. This is what I think when I accept a speaking engagement. It's like Paris, panic, and then summer is afterwards, so I'm going to be okay. But I can't see my presentation notes, so I don't know what to do. It's 9:13 and 21 seconds. 23.
No, we can do that. It's not this thing. No, this is a shortcut. How to exit that? And then presenter notes.
Merci beaucoup.
Okay.
So the first thing is to say thank you. I shouldn't forget that. Coming up with a topic for a conference like this was not difficult for me, because I've spent most of the last 2 years working on variable fonts. And I think that that's probably the best thing to talk about at this point. Some of the littlest things that interest me are common to many type designers. The exact location of a point where an almost straight line changes, the broad sweeping curves that give shapes the exact kind of roundness. And other elements too small for most people to notice, much less to name. But now we have a sea change in type technology, variable fonts, where huge quantities of typographic potential can easily be stored and transmitted in a single file from one computer to another. And with a few lines of CSS, such a file can turn a computer screen into a reasonable facsimile of, among other things, our typographic pasts. Such fonts used openly in a worldwide environment can also have a great impact on the typography of the present, as well as forming entirely new kinds of type. The most elemental piece of my thinking are the roots of typography. And primarily I'm talking about workhorse typefaces that you could use for a lot of purposes, as opposed to the beautiful and interesting display faces that people make out of various things, including digital ones. But you know, as you saw from the last presentation, graphic designers have a way of seeing type in just about anything you can imagine. And I've never thought of lettuce as containing type. It fuels me. I eat a lot of lettuce and then I make type. But I'm interested to see when graphic designers take a shortcut and they just use the lettuce and make fonts. So that's something that many graphic designers think that type designers think that they're crazy, but it's part of the environment of typography, and it's important for everybody to understand. What I'm talking about is workhorse types. And these just have a few kind of elements that create all the designs and all the scripts in the world. These elements come in two colors. One color is opaque or black or something, and the other is white and transparent or nothing. It depends on how you're talking about it and also how you're thinking about it. And I think of type as not being black on white. I think of it as being an opacity that you give to somebody to do with as they please. In fact, most people who draw typefaces don't realize that the line that they draw is transparent. You see it on the screen while you're drawing, and you think of the letter as being starting with that black line, but it doesn't actually start there. It's a transparent line that you create that encloses the black or thing or opacity. And this is important to me because it's exactly the same as punch cutting. When somebody cut a metal punch, they started with a square piece of metal on the front, and they never touched what was going to be black. They only touched the white part and got rid of it all, created nothing, so that when they struck the letter in, it created the thing that they needed. So, and I tell this story in an article I wrote a year or two ago, and it's important because at one point Adobe tried to change that and say that the line was part of it, because it made it a lot easier to render if the line that you took could be just drawn as a bunch of pixels. But that made all the letters in the world that had already been digitized look like they had been dipped in chocolate. So as much as I liked that idea, it didn't really work that way. So Adobe had to change their rendering completely at the last minute for the release of PostScript, because people like Linotype and Donald Knuth and other people disagreed with what they were doing. And it would have meant that everybody would have had to redigitize everything that was already digitized. So both elements, both colors come in three flavors. Something, or nothing comes in each color, and the beginnings and ends of each thing exist, and the connections of each thing to itself exist. And I should be clear that there are gray areas before I show you how I make these divisions. Every typeface has a different way of showing you where these things are, and it's not like here's where the thing ends and here's where the connection starts. It's more of just a mental exercise. So this is what the things are. They are the stems, the bars, the arms, the legs are about half of what type designers think about. Those are the things, and if you show everything else, you can still see sort of what it is, but not exactly. And then these are the connections of things that bring them together, and seen and removed, these bridge the differences between the things as they connect, and are the expansion and contraction joints for the changes that you do to the letters. And then there are the beginnings and ends of things, and the balls, the feet, serifs, tails, terminals, whether they have any flavor or not, they affect greatly what we see. When people say serif, you think right away about a kind of typeface, and when you say sans serif, people imagine something without you ever showing them anything. And if I remove these, as you see on the right, it hardly has much of effect on the letters. Now, Sumner Stone taught me about the first three things. We were driving down a road fighting about whether or not you should be allowed to design type on a screen, which everybody takes for granted now, but Adobe once said you had to draw everything by hand and then you digitized it. And when I started doing this other way, there was great consternation and arguments and people screaming at me, actually saying, "Fuck you." Here in France, 15 years ago, I said, "You should be able to do this," and Sumner, "Fuck you," which is not like Sumner. So he was really upset. And then it took me about 15 years to figure out that the nothings were a parallel to the somethings, but because Sumner had learned these three things while being taught calligraphy, calligraphers really are, they just have the background there and they draw on it, and they think about that background and where they're putting the letters. But I decided that the three things have three nothings that are sort of the yin and the yang of this. So the nothings, the chief of nothing is the nothing that's enclosed in a typeface, in a letter. Each one of those things we call them counters in some places, and the counters are like very, very important, that you can see from the counters what the shapes are, and if you remove them, you can still see something, except that the H has turned into the end of text character instead. So it's a problem there. Connections to nothing are the least important to show, but they're the most important in distinguishing letters. If I just show them on the left, you have no idea what's going on. If I take them away and I set that text, you would be confused trying to read that letter. So some people call these apertures, but really they're connecting two pieces of nothing to each other, and the letter is constricting that or not. So a lot of modern typefaces have a C like this, and then older ones have a C like this. And this is more information, and this is easier to render. And so a lot of typefaces have become this, so that they're easy for the computer. So the beginning and end of nothing is, we have a unit that starts where the set width of the glyph is, and that's the beginning of nothing, and it flows around the character to the end of nothing. And if you take that away, as you see on the left here, you can still read it. It's actually a design style in many places. But you wouldn't want to read text, for example. So for lots of purposes, you can do that, but for other purposes, you can't. And so these things are common to all scripts and all designs of all scripts that aren't ornamented completely. And if they're ornamented or made out of some organic material or something, they just gain sort of a quality to the edge of them that adds something else to them. So here is looking at three characters from Japanese, and you can see that these are all in the same alphabet, but they have a vastly different complexity to the glyphs. And we have a certain amount of this in Latin as well. But you can see that the more complex the Chinese glyph gets, the less the beginnings and ends of things make sense, as opposed to the characters on the other side, where a Japanese person could see those beginnings and endings and fill in the middle. And here are the connections of nothings, comparing these. The first two Chinese characters have no apertures whatsoever. They're wide open spaces. And then the next one has 12 apertures in one glyph. And then below you see the Latin alphabet that has a total of 4 in this design. So as you can imagine, with an 8,000 character Chinese set, there are maybe 60 or 70,000 apertures in it. And so you see that the balance in each script is different of how the elements are used and how they work together. And the system is complete for me because when I remove all these things, there's everything is accounted for, and there's nothing left, and there's not even nothing left. There's nothing. There's less than nothing. There's a void in the letter forms, and if there's anything left over, then I know I'm dealing with some sort of a special case of something. And then these elements are classifiable by at least these 4 things, and there are some people that have a lot more, but I'm just going to talk about these. What is the general shape of something, whether it is round or the element has round parts, or it's a square part, or it's triangular, or it's a combination. And then there's the orientation of the dimension that stylistically changes them. So you have a rectangle for an uppercase I, and we measure across the I this way to see how thick it is relative to other letters, and then this way the letter adjusts at different sizes. So there's always one dimension that has one kind of importance, and in the other dimension it's another kind of importance. And then there's the location of the element within a glyph, whether it's the left side of the glyph or the right side of the glyph, the top or the bottom or the middle, is important to how the element is going to work with that letter and the other letters. And then, of course, what glyph it is in, and what glyph group that glyph is in, and how many scripts there are in the font has a great effect on how you plan the design and the measuring of the elements. And the measuring takes us to the parametric issues of type. And the parametric variety in a typeface, you can almost imagine from looking at the parameters, if you're as old as I am, what the typeface will look like. So these are absolute measures relative to the m-square that the type is designed on. And they are relative measures to other elements. So I design things and I make sure that they work optically, and then I measure them afterwards in some cases, and sometimes I just set up a very rigid grid, and that grid is where the letters have to go. It depends on what kind of a letter you're trying to draw, but you can see in this first slide that if the elements are all of a single kind, like all the things have a very similar parametric value, you can see that all the stems here are 68 or so, and that all the nothing in the middle is very close to being the same size, and all the beginnings and ends, the side bearings, are all very close to each other. And if you showed me a chart of this typeface, I would say this is a modular font. I wouldn't have to look at it. So, or if the style has a lot of things that are close to it, like most sans serifs, all of the things are about the same measure. Whether they're vertical or horizontal, they have very little relative difference to each other. But on the other hand, the nothings have the same kind of variety as they do in a serif face, or because of the geometry, or because of the style of writing that the characters are trying to show you. There is, you know, the things all are clustered here, and the nothings are spread out in value over a wide variety of shapes. And the beginnings and ends of round things are different here than they were in the previous typeface, because there's a square typeface doesn't capture so much nothing as opposed to a round face does. And then finally, you have other styles where the proper design has a wobbly edge and great parametric variety. It's a little hard to see here, but the left and right stems of the O have significant difference, and the left and right stems of the H have a significant difference. And that stem of the S going across is one of the largest stems in the alphabet. And this is based on the Kish typeface, and it was developed for the Los Angeles Times. And it was a very difficult project, because just as we finished making this very, very wobbly, extremely old style looking typeface, they wanted a web version, and there was just no way that the memory at the time could handle a typeface like this. So I had to sort of filter out of this design what was necessary to keep in it for the web, and they're using it still to this day, which kind of makes me happy. So to me, the parametric aspects of a typeface in a workhorse typeface family that's going to be fairly large, you're trying to make all these shapes and parameters match to form a series of styles that will work together. And then there's great complexity when you have to mix these elements to work in multiple scripts. But mixing the elements in the styles of 2 or 3 different typefaces together is really the goal of most design documents. We've been sort of pushed into this corner by technology over the last 25 years, where there are a lot of companies who just use a sans serif typeface. And unfortunately, 4 of these companies are Apple, Microsoft, Google, and Adobe. And that's the alliance that's trying to bring variable fonts to the world. So they have a very, very narrow scope of view of what typography is, based on their own personal choices, which are basically these rather characterless sans serif faces. And that is not the real tragedy of Helvetica. The real tragedy of Helvetica is this kind of design is being almost forced on all the scripts of the world to make a consistent set of user interface fonts for the world. And not all typeface, not all scripts in the world really lend themselves to being Helvetica. So when people sort of complain about Helvetica, I keep my mouth shut because they don't even know what the biggest problem is yet. I don't love Helvetica. I work for the company who made it, and I appreciate what it does. It provides a background for all the other things that people say. And when they say that Helvetica is boring, a lot of people say Helvetica is boring, but then they make this very exciting design, and when they turn the identity over to text, they go to a sans serif face anyways, because that provides a good background for whatever they're doing. So as much as you might hate sans serifs or despise Helvetica, without them you don't have a background to argue against. So I love it because, you know, the sans serif gives this background for people to argue against, if nothing else. So here I show a kind of a worksheet that I use after I've designed the typeface. Some of the parameters have to be recorded. While I'm working on the typeface, some of the parameters have to be there, mostly to do with alignments. And everybody uses guidelines, or just about everybody, for a typeface they're working on. But just because the cap height is some number, it doesn't necessarily mean that all the letters are that high. In the modular typeface I showed you, they are. But in just about every other typeface, those are just guidelines, and optically everything gets put together as it needs to be seen. But in the end, if you're doing hinting or if you're making a larger typeface family, you want to have the parametric values. You want a chart like this so that you know what you're doing as far as relating the parts of the typeface families together. So when in the end, we really only give the user a few parameters to work with. They have a point size, and they have a bunch of weights to choose from by numbers. But underlying that is this deep hierarchy of values in the typeface that the designer either makes by doing it with their eyes, or some combination of measuring and doing things. So variable type is some sort of control over these root elements in a parametrically based system of changes. And that's been going on for centuries. For optical sizes, people have been doing this. For different weights, people have doing this. For different widths, people have doing this. And you used to be able to, in the days of metal type, order a font that had different widths. So because there was no tracking, and it was very expensive to put little pieces of metal in between each letter. If somebody had two different uses of the typeface, they might have two different fonts with the same glyphs, but different amounts of metal on either side. And the same thing would happen vertically. You could set type 12 on 12, but if you wanted to set it 12 on 14, then you had to put all these little pieces of metal in between the lines, and sometimes that was just too expensive for newspapers or magazines, so they would order the type with the leading built in. So that's a parametric change to the beginnings and ends of nothing that's been around for centuries. And in fact, when punch cutters work, they don't say how wide the character is going to be. You cut the letter, and then the person who punches it in has fit it onto a piece of metal, brass usually, to make the mold, to make the letters. So those are two different operations in the old days, where the punch cutter might suggest the width of it, but in the end, if it was going to work with a machine, the punch cutter didn't really have any control over how wide the characters. So, but up until recently, the dominant font format, which is OpenType, has not been very friendly to storing very much detail about the parametrics. Or actually, I should say, I call this panametric type because variable fonts offer all of the parameters that you can have. Whatever axes the designer builds in, it's a solid interpolation between the variable font on one end of the spectrum and the variable font on the other end. So it's a panametric buffet for the user to take advantage of. But OpenType has not been very friendly about expressing this information to the user. For the most part, we've been trying to capture this information in the names, and that can drive users nuts. If I gave somebody a family of 300 styles with these names in them, I wouldn't dare, but I'd be tempted to do such a thing to prove a point that this is not the place that the user should be looking for the information about the type. The place that they should be looking at the information about the type is a different kind of an interface. That's where they have much fewer choices and much more power over what's going on. So here's a more modern chart where I have sort of wandered through this forest where the trees have these leaves that break the typeface into colors that no one knows the names of. And so I've had to sort of, I abandoned the body parts that people use for, you know, arms and legs and heads and feet and things, and just went to 4 letters because that's what the format needs. But for example, there's X, which is going this way, opaque, and X, transparent. And so slowly my foundry and my distributor are starting to speak in this language of these 4-letter acronyms, because it's much more clear once everybody knows this language. You say that to somebody and they know exactly what you're talking about. And so now my clients are using this language too. It makes it easier for us developing, but I certainly do not want to show these to users ever. Okay, so don't get the idea that you have to learn any of this stuff. So variations are important because it breaks down the barriers between the styles of a family. So you had regular and bold, and those were the designer's preferences. The type designer made those choices. And are they right for everybody? Are they right for everything? It used to be, yeah, but reality is that we got a lot of calls for customizations, which says that you've got to have a little bit more flexibility in your foundry if you're going to make a customer happy with their very specific production process, for example. So it's good that it's breaking down that barriers, but on the other hand, it makes it impossible to name all the styles in a typeface family. I have worked in this industry for many years, and I've only come up with 12 names for different widths. But what happens when you're giving somebody 1,000 widths? I mean, how do you name those? So that's one issue. And if you're giving somebody something with 6 axes, 6 variable axes, and they each have 1,000 possibilities, you do the math, you try to name it. I don't know how to do it except just hide all that stuff from the user and let them decide what to call the styles. So on one hand you have the barriers broken down, on the other hand it's hard to name everything that resists. On one hand, bringing the possibility of unlimited numeric variation of the root elements, and on the other hand having no standard names for most of them. On one hand, making font development much more complex, while on the other hand offering the potential for much more sophisticated use with less trouble in composition. So I call this panametric type because it offers all the values of whatever parameters it includes for from the creator to the user. Here I show one of the plan drawings. These are the kinds of drawings that I was making before we had any tools for this round of variations. And I should say that I experienced the first round of variations in 1992, and that sort of has proven now to have been a time machine to take me forward to 2015 to show me really what was going to be like now. And then I started working back then towards this day because it was inevitable for a number of reasons. So this is one of the plan drawings, and it used to have a caption underneath that said, "This is an illustration that's too complicated for you to understand. Don't let it bother you." But I made it for Santiago Orozco, who was who at the time was my intern, and now he's founded his own foundry in Monterrey, Mexico. And what it shows is what I had been thinking I would do to make grades. Grades are very slight variations of the weight of a typeface without changing the width. And the first time we ever got a call for these was from Playboy magazine, and Playboy magazine in the early 90s was switching over to PostScript, but they weren't changing their printing process. So they had a gravure press for all of the pages that had skin, and an offset press for the pages that had type. And all we were reading was the type, of course, but the two fonts had to match. And so we went through this process of making these two weights of Baskerville that went on for about 4 months, and we kept on making the grade higher and lighter and heavier and lighter. And then finally I got an apology from the manager of the production department that the first one that we had given them was right, and there was a little note attached. This is back when people sent packages to each other in the mail, and I had 2 copies of the magazine and a little note on it saying, "My deepest apologies, I needed my eyes examined, hef." So the publisher had basically was losing his vision at the time and driving me nuts. But we then applied that to the problem of newspaper typefaces. Mike Parker, who was at Linotype, had come to join me at Font Bureau and to teach Tobias Fair-Jones about text faces. And so he started working on something called the Pointer Project, the Pointer Study for the Pointer Center for Media Studies in St. Petersburg, Florida, gathered a bunch of newspaper designers together to discuss the issues of high-speed presses, cheaper inks, cheaper papers, and how that was going to affect things. And the effects of that study is that we decided that we would make grades of the Pointer series, 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then we would supply the whole thing as a package, and the newspaper would choose which ones they wanted, and those were the grades that they would get. And this was a little bit different from the grades that are made today with variable fonts, because that was the grades of a weight. So you had the regular weight, and then it had 4 grades. And this illustration is an attempt to grasp what happens when you try to make the grades of an entire range of weights of a typeface. And what I learned from this experiment that we had thought about, me and Tom Rickner, who worked at Apple at the time, and we were working on the variations technology together and trying to figure out other things that you could do with it, and I knew about grades, and so I tried to figure out how I would make grades, and it basically came down to taking the regular weight and the bold weight, and then putting the bold weight on the regular widths and the light weight on the bolder widths, and then if you interpolated in a square, you got all of the grades of all the weights. Because you had just swapped these two parameters, the width and the weight were swapped in the space. And what that left you with was the master was in the middle, and that gray thicker line shows you all the grades of the master weight. But in order to get all the grades of the other weights, you had to go somewhere else. And the variable interface doesn't allow that, really. The variable font has to have everything go through the master. So we did that whole project, but you ended up with this gigantic space of weights and grades, and the user had to actually go find what they wanted, and I just said, forget it. But it was that experiment that led to parametric control of the main elements and organized my mind into how to use the variable font technology. And what it says is that you make these axes that just contain the changes to one thing at a time. And if you just change one thing at a time, you can add those changes together because of the way the technology works and create a regular looking typeface family, but the person can go to any place in the design space and get grades. So I got a call from Google right after the announcement, and I had started working on this before because there had been a whole 9-month inside of the type industry arguing about whether variable fonts should happen, and I was fairly quiet about it. But at the same time, I was designing, and I tried to do this serif typeface back in the 90s called Millennium, that I was using variable technology from Apple, and I got so confused about what was going on that I just quit and ended up making 4 typeface families out of that variation font. One of them was Giza, another one was called Millennium that was for the Chicago Tribune, and there were 2 other serif typefaces that I just split out and made normal fonts. This time I didn't want to do that, and so I started out with another failure, but then this whole thing dawned on me that the reversing of the parameters through this master would give you this huge kaleidoscope of styles. I understood that I was going to have to get very, very good control over the elements, the roots, the 6 pieces were going to have to be controlled separately. And they were going to have just the right parametric changes and just the right panametric range in order to make this work. And so then Google called and said, you know, can you give me some variable fonts, because this thing's going to launch in August. And I said, well, I can start on them. And so they asked me for a font that had 20 axes. And I said, I don't think you want that. So we argued for a long time about how best to do this, and it ended up being broken up into 2 fonts. One of them is a toy, Decovar, and you can look at that from the links online. I won't go into it too much, but it is literally based on the elements. The elements, it's a modular typeface. It doesn't look modular, but it's based on the elements, and you can have like an unlimited number of variations in it. And that was going to be the typeface that was going to satisfy the number of axes that he wanted. And then the face you're looking at now is called Amstelvar, and this was going to prove a totally different point, having just the right number of axes and no more. But we ended up with more than 20 axes when we were done, and I'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. But so typically grade changes the weight, as I've said. And if you look, I make movies of variable fonts that people can barely see what's going on. But this face has just changed grades while you were sitting here looking at me, as opposed to the bouncing around the screen type. I make type that you have to really watch carefully. So everything here is also staying the same. The first I adjust the grade, and then I very slowly adjust the contrast to a much higher contrast typeface. You didn't see anything, did you? Okay, now then the next one is as a typographer, I am aware that people have used different line lengths, different column widths, and the longer a line is, the more line spacing the person needs to recover to find the next line. The narrower the column width is, the less line spacing there could be. But the descenders and ascenders need to move ideally in order to make that happen. So here you see, if you watch the word type up there, it should move eventually so that the descenders get longer. I'm not getting my movies here. Oh, there it goes. All right. So, and then what I do is I change the column width, and so now they're too long for the column width. And if you watch carefully, the word type is in the fourth line in the middle, and the descenders are going to go up to where they belong. And this is sort of a valuable thing for people who are doing web programming, where you don't know what the column's going to be. But with this technology, you can set your narrowest column, and you make your descenders the way you want for the narrowest column. You can set it for the widest column, make the descenders you want for the widest column, and then CSS will interpolate in between so that every column width is going to have, assuming you're adjusting the line spacing, which is what we are doing in addition, you'll get the right stuff in between. And this is the kind of thing that I'm talking about, where you give the person a tremendous amount of power without actually having them have to use it. So we can give somebody an algorithm that will properly line space, and we can give somebody a font with descenders, and all they have to do is make the decisions on the ends, and everything else works fine, ideally. So that's three elements. There is my roots, my parameters, the fact that it's a panametric system now, but it isn't anything without the user. And most people have never heard about this, but they work with it all the time. The first time I learned about it, I asked Greg Hitchcock at Microsoft why I couldn't adjust the accents in hinting at a certain time in the process, and he said, that's because of the mantra. And I said, the what? And I was on the West Coast, so you got to be tolerant to those people out there. But it is the specification of the font. It is, and operating systems have to have every answer. And this is the biggest difference between analog type and digital type, is that if I'm a typographer in the 1920s, I say the name of the typeface family, and I say the weight, and I don't really have to say anything about it other than that. But when you specify a typeface that you're using today, if you just specify those things, it's only those things that change, and all these other defaults remain as they were specified. So, for example, when I told you that the line that you draw in your font program is transparent, that doesn't necessarily mean that the user can't specify it to be 2 points thick. But the default is that it is 0 thick. And the computer has to know everything. Whether you say it or not, it has this full specification in its tiny little brain, and you have to either accept the defaults or change them. And so I look at it like this, and I usually see red type a little clearer than that, but it's bright. So these are the main things that designers and type designers work with. Script, classification, family, style, treatment, effect, character, and glyphs. Some of these are familiar to you from menus in applications, and these menus all gather this information together and give it the mantra. Within these, there's sometimes a list, like what family. Others, there are subsections of the spec going into details of effects and treatments. And I define effects as something that you do to the typeface that I've given you, and a treatment is something that you're going to add to it. So if you're going to add a drop shadow or an underline or something, that is the computer generating something to add a treatment to the font. And effect is just like, it's the size that you just that you decide to use. So it doesn't cover the entire mantra most of the time, because when you install your system, you choose the nationality that you're working in, and that sometimes nationalities have multiple languages, and you have to choose that too. But by the time you're done, you've specified what every document you're going to create is going to have for a script. So that happens when you install the operating system. And in HTML, the first line of just about every HTML document is something like meta character set equals UTF equals 8, which to me doesn't mean anything, but to my computer it means Latin, right? At the end of the specification, besides the chart, and besides the things that designers and type designers get involved in, are decisions that are made automatically in applications or by device drivers or in JavaScript, or cascading style sheets, making appropriate queries and taking the appropriate steps to output the typography wherever the user aims their publication. So I almost never associate my typeface with a particular resolution, like 16 pixels is not really that important to me, but it's very important to people who use the typeface, and so I have to make some things happen, like hints or something, or regularize the design of the typeface so that if somebody wants it to work really well at 16, then that intrudes into the process. But typically we leave that stuff to software as type designers, because the resolution is increasing so much that we have less and less to worry on that particular thing. There's not to mention that in the fields of both graphic and web design, there can be a lot of specification back and forth. We don't read text directly across the page. We read like this. It's called a saccade. And we always do. You don't know about it. They didn't even know about it until they started tracking people's eyes. They just assumed that you just read with your eyes straight across the page, but it's a much, much more complicated biological process than that, where, and they're still not quite sure whether you just stop to rest or you stop because there's something, you know, there's an aperture missing, or whether there's a word you don't know, you don't understand, or a combination of words you don't understand. But the same process goes on in specification. The graphic designer starts out and they say, well, it's going to be Latin, and it's going to be Helvetica, and then they might say, well, no, I'm sick of Helvetica. I don't like it as much as Gil Sans or as Helvetica New, if they're really adventurous. So it goes back and forth, and sizes are the same way. And even after the graphic designer is done, there's this, in a web situation, there's this thing that goes on with the sizes where each device that a person downloads it to lands in a separate place in the mantra. So style treatment and effect are really changing with variable fonts because the barriers are broken down. While both modern and old processes allowed for different treatments, like the same metal font in different X and Y bodies, the traditional digital designs, even more treatments to letter spacing and leading were allowed, and variations is the first time that all 6 of the root elements I started with in the beginning are going to be available to the user. It used to be that the nothing in the middle was blocked, you know, even in digital type. If you wanted to change that inside, you were more likely to ruin the typeface by scaling it horizontally only. So, and obviously in metal type, you couldn't get to that inside, but you could get to the outside. You could file off the edges if you want. You could do all kinds of stuff to metal type. And in digital type, there's basically a seamless connection between the beginnings and endings of things in the type and the letter spacing and the line spacing of type, and tracking and the ability of the user to add kerning to the font makes that part of it fully integrated with variations type. And so for the first time, the other parts of it are also integrated. And this includes the nothing in the middle, and the heights of things can be changing. And this is not just for, you know, an animation, although variable fonts has some very interesting possibilities in animation. But otherwise, if you wanted to animate something, you have to go in and do a lot of work to get that stuff to move around. Now with variable fonts, it's going to be considerably easier. And I did some demonstrations of that the first round with a font called Zycon with a bicycle mover, a bicycle rider, and a lizard, and you can see those things on the web these days with people doing them. And there's also a wonderful person from Australia named Mandy Michael, who grabs everything that I do and makes things with it, and she's done some code, published some stuff on, I don't know what it's called, CodeBot or something like that, where she shows Decovar growing grass, which I didn't really plan on, but she's really an interesting creative. So that sort of leaves me trying to pull it all together, which typically requires the demonstration of this traditional root-based parametric type and a panametric font through the steps of mantra and script all the way out to rendering, as it might be required for one or more jobs spanning a range of document types. And that's what I'm being asked to do now by Google and Microsoft, to prove that my way of making type has some benefit to workhorse typefaces in the world. There is a there's a problem with this, in that they completely fucked up the format. You see over here where it says wrong. What's wrong about this is that these are the point size masters, and you can see, if you have your eyes open and haven't fallen asleep from the beer, that there are differences. It's pretty obvious. And so I want to record those differences. You can see the X transparency of these two H's is actually the same. I've added most of the way to the outside because the smaller sizes need to get wider. But then here, it's much narrower. It goes from 804 units to 616. You can see everything else is changing. All of my parametric values are changing from one face to another. That is illegal. You can't do that in the format. They all have to be the same, and that doesn't work. So I have all the parametric ingredients in my type to define the are you going to run? No. Are you running? Hello? Amstelar? It's on. It's used to being asleep at this time. I'm just going to leave. I can't touch it. Did something happen? Oh well. Anyways, so what you're seeing forming here is one parametric axis at a time. I am changing the X height. I'm going to try it again. Okay, so I'm changing the X transparency to make a smaller size. And then I'm changing the weight a little bit to make it heavier, as you saw in the H going on. And then I'm changing the X height. And then I'm changing the ascenders. Okay? And these are happening one thing at a time, but they equal optical size minimum. And then for the optical size maximum, everything goes in the opposite direction. I'm making it narrower, I'm making it lighter, I'm giving it more contrast, and I'm shrinking the X height, and I'm not changing the ascender because I want it to be more efficient. The thing that people don't understand about optical sizes, I spent 2 days at Microsoft explaining this, is that they don't just go down for benefit. What most people know is that a smaller optical size has changed the way I do it for easier reading, but the larger size is for more information to be more space for information. So optical size has a benefit going up in that you can get more information in less space. Going down, you get more legibility, but it takes more space. So then when you, these things are blended together to form, I'm now magically moving the weight axis, and these are blended together so I can get to a light and I can get to a black. And notice that I'm still at 12 points. So this is a 12-point super extra wide. Okay? And then here, I've blended the X transparency, and I've changed the weight, and I've changed the contrast a little bit to make the width axis happen. Again, you see that these are all 12-point masters. That if this may look like it's awkward and lots of space in it, but if you see this at 12-point, it's very clear. And then I repeat the second slide that I did before, taking it, showing you the width axis and action, and ending out at the widest width. .12 still. And then down below, I go to about the same space. I wanted to try to keep it on the same line in the second example. So I don't go to exactly the same space, but you'll get the idea. And so this is a 12-point, and now I'm going to go across the optical size axis. And you see that I've combined everything. I didn't have to draw any of this stuff. It just happens because I'm careful. I understand the elements I'm working with. I'm looking at the parametric values very carefully. And once you blend all this stuff together, you have this gigantic space of design that I have no idea how to price. But I'm sure we'll come up with something. So this is what I want to happen, which is that when you change the optical size, these parametric axes show you where they're going. Okay? And the reason for that is so A, the user can make little tiny changes if they want to, or B, you can program something to look better on a retina, or to have its you guys want to see that one again? Yes. Or to have its, see, I can do it. This is great. I like this. Normally you have to do this with your hands and move stuff around, and just having my robot here with me is so much fun. So the idea is that you can turn this typeface over to a specification for a whole bunch of viewports and devices that it's being output on, and you can say, you can just pinpoint what's going to have to happen in those devices and write it in CSS. Just change the type in CSS. So the object of the game is to create a user interface where the type designer gets to, the type designer makes something like this for a workhorse typeface, and then the user gets basically 3 axes: width, weight, and optical size. Optical size should operate automatically. Weight and width are things that are sometimes chosen you know, by visual inspection, which is what I call fishing, and sometimes they're done by figuring. So for example, in a, and sometimes both. So you may decide that you are going to go to a narrower column, and you're not just going to make some changes, but you can actually make the type narrower. There are some people who are using the width axis now to completely squish the type when it goes onto the phone and then let it loose on the desktop. And there are various different ways that people can harness this technology to use it. But in the end, what I'm trying to do is make it so that things that are familiar to them are a small number of sliders, and then the things that are more familiar to the production or to the details of the design working in a various place are available for programming. And so that gives everybody some sort of or it gives a lot of different parts of an organization a way into variable fonts that can be very valuable for them. If they're publishing a magazine with different printing technologies being used, and it's also going to the web, then you could have people using all of these axes for different things in a workhorse typeface. This is not to say that there aren't a lot of axes that are just plain fun, because that is going to be the majority, I think, of what variations are, is people coming up with ways to animate things and do interesting visual things that are not necessarily associated with the very fine points of reading, which is pretty much what I understand. Thank you.
Only 14 years after its birth, the iconic Bauhaus School of Design was shut down by the Nazi regime. Many treasures and unfinished masterpieces were left behind, lost to the world. Founded on the central idea of training a new generation of artists to create a better world, Bauhaus laid the foundation for modern design as we know it and changed creativity forever. But in 1930s Germany, the progressive ideas of the Bauhaus were considered threatening, and the school's closure became inevitable. But sometimes, what's been lost to history can be brought back. The influence of Bauhaus lives on, and now you can design with a piece of living history.